Well, I'm Bev Jackson of LGB Alliance, and I'm really excited today to be speaking to Faika El-Nagashi, who was until a few months ago an Austrian MP representing the Green Party. She has a long history of progressive activism, and specifically in many European LGBT groups, and she recently co-authored a powerful article together with Anna Zopnina entitled "How Europe Lost the Plot on Women's Rights." Well, we'll be discussing some of the broader issues around gender identity and Europe. And many thanks for all the questions you sent in. After our initial discussion, we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. So welcome, Faika. So happy to see you today. How are you?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, Beth.
So perhaps you could talk to us for a little bit about your past as an LGBT activist within the broader European context.
Yes, happy to do so. Sometimes it seems like a bit of a far stretch to go back to the very beginnings. I turn 50 next year, and I started my work as a political activist quite young, when I was about 18 or 19. So right after I came out as a lesbian, well, first to myself when I was about 16, 17, and then as soon as I could to the outside world. And I was really looking for those spaces to be active in. So not only to have something like a community for myself, but also to work around all of these issues on a personal level, but at the same time also on a political level. And quite soon I got involved with European organizations that worked on these issues. The first one was IGLIO, which is the youth organization of the big LGBTIQ organization ILGA. And so I was active with IGLIO for some time. And then later on, I became active with the ELC, which is the Euro Central Asian Lesbian with an asterisk community. And before that, a couple of years before that, I worked with ILGA Europe. So out of the big organizations, so we would say that there are 5 big NGOs on the European level working on LGBTIQ issues. That is ILGA Europe, it's ELC, it's TGEU, which is a trans organization, and it's OII, which is an intersex organization, and IGLIO, the youth organization of ILGA. I've been actively involved with 3 of those organizations throughout the past years and decades. So
you were really at the heart of the whole LGBTQI project in Europe, you could say. And yet
yes.
Something at some point changed, didn't it? And how did that change for you? And perhaps you could say something, you already mentioned the European Central European Asian Lesbian, it's got such a long name, I always forget, your experience with that conference that you were very, very closely involved with.
Yeah, I think 2 things changed. So one is the issue itself. So what I was working on back then, when I was at the student union, I was active in the student union. I was the first officer of a new department that was set up at the student union, and it was called the Department for Homo, Bi, and Transsexual Affairs. So that was the end of the 1990s. So the issue was a very different one back then. We were not talking about self-ID. We were not talking about a trans umbrella. We were not talking about non-binary. We were not talking about trans kids or adolescents at all. So the issue itself changed through the course of the last years, decades, almost years more. And the other thing was that there were a reality manifested itself to this activism or this activist work that really highlighted the contradictions and the harm between the activism, the legal sphere, and then the reality of it. And I think it was probably around 2017. So I've been a politician with the Greens since 2015. And so for the past 10 years, and around 2017, I attended the first lesbian conference of the ELC that took place in Vienna. And at that lesbian conference, and it was already a lesbian with an asterisk conference, I had a good friend visit me back from Igloo times. We were both active in Igloo in our youth. And she is an Irish woman who's based in the UK. And we talked a bit, and she said to me at one point, well, you know, trans women are not women. And that at that time in my context was something that nobody would say out loud, or only very few, some red femme groups maybe.
You say they wouldn't say it out loud. Did they think it, or did they, I mean, had you thought this to yourself and thought this is something I know but I mustn't say? What, or did you not?
It was not really so much the focus of thinking. It was not the crucial idea or the crucial slogan to look at or to dismantle. It was like noise on the side around the activism and the political work you were doing, and everybody was assuming we were still doing the same that we were always doing, fighting discrimination, advocating for human rights, equality, and so on. But her being based in the UK, she had a very different experience already. Things have moved very differently in the UK to the rest of Europe. And so she started talking with me about all of these incidents of men in prisons, women's shelters, realities that did not yet manifest at all here with us. And I remember that my initial reaction was very skeptical and very much along the lines of, well, why would this happen? You know, why would men go to the length of doing all of this just to gain access? But it also started my thinking and being able to critically look at the demands, at what we were doing and what I was doing, basically hearing it from a friend and hearing it from a trusted person and position allowed me to, you know, move intellectually and emotionally.
And so when you moved and then you started speaking out about these issues, what was the reaction and how did you react to that reaction?
Well, it took me some time to really develop a position on this, and a position that I also felt comfortable articulating and also felt compelled to articulate. So that was in 2017, and the following year, 2018 and 2019, I became very active with the ELC, with the Euro Central Asian lesbian * community, and I saw from the inside what was happening within this organization that aspired to become a voice for lesbians, to renew the lesbian movement across Europe and Central Asia, but also to attract funding, of course. And I was having a lot of conversations internally with my colleagues on the board about this, and you know, trying to get a response, to engage in discussions. But there was also this reality that the funders were very clear that they were only looking to fund trans-inclusive projects. So faced with that, the organization moved to be very explicit and more explicit on being trans-inclusive, which meant that in not only in name, but in position papers, in the composition of the board, of the events and activities that took place. And then in 2022, by then I had stepped down from the board and was a member of parliament. That was when I spoke publicly in my national context. So in Austria, I spoke publicly, quite critically, but I think quite moderately also about the issue, and then was uninvited and unregistered from the conference and from attending the conference.
How surprised were you that reaction, that's what happened?
I was quite surprised because I was a bit blindsided by it. I was actually on my way to Hungary, to Budapest, where the conference was about to take place. And just weeks before, somebody had been in touch with me because I was born in Hungary. My mother is Hungarian, and They got in touch with me to ask me if I knew maybe of locations for the conference. They knew that I was coming. I mean, we were not close by then anymore with my former colleagues on the board, but I had registered weeks before just to attend as a participant. And then I received an email 5 minutes to midnight, the day before is when they sent it, just 2 or 3 lines saying that because of my public statements, they are unregistering me, refunding me the registration fee. And it was not even signed by names, but just the board. So
have you had any contact? I mean, it's a shocking thing, isn't it? This is a conference. You were originally with one of the early conferences. You were responsible for organizing it. You'd been involved right up to the last minute. Have you had any contact with these people since then?
With a few of them. I mean, when I was there in Budapest while the conference took place, 2 or 3 of the participants who were quite active, they met with me. They were horrified. I had good conversations with one board member afterwards, but in general, they refused to then, talk with me or engage with me on a personal level. I really wanted to know
they
more.
think you're a bigot. You've suddenly become a right-wing bigot. Is this the story? Is that what they really think?
I don't know if that's what they really think. I don't think that it's possible to think that, because they know me personally, like not only my political track record or what I've been doing, either be it as a politician, as a political activist. I worked on human rights, women's rights, lesbian and gay rights, with migrant women, with refugee women, so that's one aspect. But the other thing is they also know me personally. And so that is a kind of, yes, ostracism and isolation that is it really affected me at that time. It affected me a lot. But it also had this dimension that how can they say to a lesbian, that you're not welcome at a lesbian conference, without even specifying the reasons for it. They didn't even say which public statements or what it was that I actually said that was in conflict with them as an organization or with their conference.
This is a pattern. You get accused of some sort of vague, Kafkaesque kind of situation in which you've done something bad. We don't know what bad thing it is, but therefore you've stepped outside the mold and you no longer belong. Let's move to a sort of wider issue of recent developments within the Council of Europe and the EU. And perhaps you could talk a little bit. I know that you mentioned to me the influence of Soji-esque, which I'm afraid I've just learned to pronounce it. Perhaps you could explain what that is.
Yes, so I think the main point is to say that in the last years, unbeknownst to many, and definitely the general public, gender identity ideology, or if you prefer to call it gender identity doctrine, has manifested itself, has institutionalized itself in these European bodies. So it's the EU, but it's also the Council of Europe, and it has been mainstreamed into different areas and fields of policy. So there are different aspects to this, and one main issue, of course, is with the funding. This is more the case for the European Union, when there is so much funding that is channeled to these big organizations that, of course, then advocate and push for gender identity ideology, again, within the EU. But the other aspect is how commonplace this understanding has become. And it is in so many policy fields. It affects education, health, equality, of course, anti-discrimination, hate speech, that's a big one. And then there are specific documents that are being created with the input of those organizations, with those NGOs that are receiving the funding as stakeholders. And so at the same time,
this is funding again. And I mean, we haven't discussed that explicitly, but I mean, do you seem to think that funding is absolutely the key factor here? what is pushing this agenda is the need to get funds. But we spoke earlier about the language that has taken over. Perhaps you could say a little bit about that.
Yes, I think it's a good example when you talk about the Soji-esque unit that you said you only learned how to pronounce. Well, what does it actually mean? So the Soji-esque unit at the Council of Europe is a successor of what was the Soji unit. So the Soji unit is short for sexual orientation and gender identity. And that was set up in 2014 to, well, mainstream sexual orientation, gender identity into the human rights work and the work on democracy of the Council of Europe. And now it is sexual orientation, gender identity and expression and sex characteristics. So it is Soji-esque. Most people don't know what it is. It is a bit the equivalent of what LGBTIQ is on that level, or what queer would be, all encompassing. But because nobody knows really what it is, and it is so lumped together, everybody assumes when it is Soji-esque, it is about lesbian and gay rights. Or it might also be about trans, but what exactly that means, nobody knows. And how then gender identity and expression come to replace other areas, whether it's linguistically or conceptually, when we talk in other areas about gender, when it used to be about equality, and equality meant equality between men and women. And that is then replaced by talking about gender equality, and then replaced by talking about gender or gender identity, and then at one point either about LGBTIQ rights or Soji-esque or queer. And this is, you find this in a lot of areas when it is about anti-discrimination regulations, for example. They would say, we want anti-discrimination for all queer people. And most people would not object to that, because they would only hear the all. And they would agree, yes, of course, for all. And they would not look at, well, what does queer mean? Who is that actually? How do you categorize that? And the same is with Soji-esque. It seems to be a box and a category, but it is not when you look at it. And it contains positions that are in contradiction to each other. The lesbian and gay rights on the one hand, for example, very clearly, often in contradiction with gender identity and with the push for gender identity. Because if you dissolve categories, you don't have same-sex attraction as a category anymore. And this is happening at the level of the Council of Europe, and that is quite influential. You know, one has to take into account that the Council of Europe addresses a much bigger area than the European Union.
Which of course includes the UK.
Which includes the UK, absolutely. And while what they are doing might not be legally binding, they are using a lot of soft power. So the Soji-esque unit, for example, is providing what they call technical support to governments, to administrations. They do trainings with the police and the judiciary. And in those trainings, it's basically a sort of capacity building that they are doing. They are pushing, of course, for their understanding and for their interpretation of recommendations and of guidelines, which then again are developed with the same organizations, the same NGOs as stakeholders that input into those documents.
So is there, I can hear everyone listening will be thinking, isn't there any chance of people like you and me getting into Soji-esque and moving it in a more sensible direction?
Well, I mean, only if we achieve to build something that is equally impactful and relevant. So when I talk about the funding on that level, my frustration is not so much with these organizations getting that much money, though I am frustrated about that. The problem is that on the other side, you have nobody. So you have no organizations, you have no associations that will speak from a position that is not caught in a polarization, in a political polarization between left and right. So you might have some institutes or some organizations that are vocal about this issue, but they do not come representing the interest, for example, of women, of lesbians and gays. They are caught up in the political instrumentalization of the issue.
So you think that the future LGB International, which will soon be a major factor on the world stage, could be an important influence here?
Absolutely. I think something like that is very necessary to not only to balance it out, but also to provide a position and a perspective that says this is about lesbian and gay rights, and we take a different position than the only other organization that is known to politicians, decision makers, media, and so on this subject.
Yeah, well, that's so that is a little bit of positive news, I think, perhaps. But I know that you do, in general, take a fairly somber view of what's been happening in Europe. Perhaps you could give us. I mean, I was thinking of recent developments in Germany and in Hungary. Perhaps you could, very different, obviously, what's happened in Germany and what's happened in Hungary. Perhaps you could say a couple of words about that.
Yes, I think what we've seen in Germany, Germany has introduced a new law on self-ID that is in effect since November 1st last year, and that basically allows self-ID without age limits. There are regulations around it that for children, you need the parents to make that decision, but in effect that means that parents can legally change the sex of their children. And I think the regulation is that from the age of 5, the child has to be heard by court on the matter.
And well, you mean the parents can change the gender of their baby?
Yeah, the legal sex entry. So baby, toddlers, and then for adolescents, they can change it themselves. If the parents do not consent, then they can go through a family court and have it changed that way. But it also, I think it is a very, very wide-ranging version of self-ID that has been implemented in Germany. It continues a non-disclosure clause, so it's not. It can be fined with up to 10,000 euros if you disclose the transition of an individual. So if you dead name them or if you misgender them, there is an exception to this clause only made for very close relatives, linear relatives, so one's children and one's spouse or former spouse, but only for those before the transition.
So in other words, if trans person X used to be married to a woman, it's okay for that woman and their children to carry on referring to him as their husband or ex-husband or father. But if he then goes on to marry another woman, she's not allowed to call him a man or to refer to the fact that he is a man. Is that correct?
Yes, to publicly disclose it.
And his new children aren't allowed to either.
Yes, to publicly disclose it. The law says in a harmful way, but that, of course, is interpretation then what is harmful. But it's very far-reaching. It's very far-reaching, and I think it's very worrying. On top of everything else, to prohibit talking about it and speaking about it publicly.
And what about the pushback? Are we seeing a pushback yet? Any sizable pushback against this?
There has been a lot of organizing going on, grassroots organizing from women, from feminists who have been very active around it, who have been protesting it before, but also when it then became law. and who are still active, but they did not have enough political power to prevent it or to stop it. And also at the same time, media reporting is very biased. And what is happening, but that's not only the case in Germany, but also in many other countries, is that the right-wing parties are taking up the criticism that is very clear around these issues, and they are politically using it. So it becomes very much then not something that is about questions of women's rights or safety and dignity, about what's happening with children and young people, or reality itself. It's not about an aspect of human rights anymore. It is about left or right.
Yeah, so I suppose that we've seen that epitomized in the United States, but it is also true in many countries in Europe. But then we've seen in Hungary a really an equally disturbing move in the opposite direction in a way, I suppose. Don't you think?
Yeah, so the government in Hungary is clearly using this politically, and is instrumentalizing it, and is using it on a symbolic level, and making it, this whole issue is framed as something of protection of children. And what they attach to it is family values, Christianity, and it becomes a strong pillar of the government of Viktor Orban. And so what they are doing is they are moving to enshrine this, or that they already did actually, in the constitution. So they put into the constitution, a father is a man, a mother is a woman, things like that. So they also put into the constitution that to defend the right of a child to be the sex that they are at birth.
Well, what about lesbian couples? How have they been affected then by this draconian new legislation in Hungary? Do you know?
Well, there is a form of registered partnership in Hungary. So there is no same-sex marriage, but there is registered partnership. And well, lesbians and gays are in a very difficult situation, I think, because they are attacked in a way by everything that this government is doing, because they are lumped into this whole group that is being attacked for various reasons. And at the same time, what comes in from the other side, from some Western NGOs and also politically, is the push for gender identity positions, is the push for LGBTIQ, is the push for something that is completely very far away from an initial understanding of lesbian and gay rights. For example, Hungary.
We see here, just as we see everywhere, that this forced teaming of LGB with TQIA plus has been incredibly bad for gay and lesbian rights, hasn't it? It's just been a disaster.
Yes, Hungary, for example, had as one of the first countries, I'm not sure if it was the first in Europe or the first globally, but it had an asexual pride. And if you think about it, how odd is it? But how odd is it? How odd is it that the first asexual pride would take place in Hungary, of all places? And there are some very strong and fierce feminists, gender critical feminists in Hungary, that really feel like they are caught between a rock and a hard place. And they get no funding on the national level. They get no funding from abroad, whether it's from the EU or from other Western foundations, and they cannot find the space really or it's very difficult for them to advocate for women's rights, based in the material reality of women, and to not be caught up in this instrumentalization, where you have to take a position on where you stand, because everything is so contested in the political climate in the country.
Yeah, the polarization between right and left wing is so difficult that we spend so much of our energy, I think, those of us who are fighting against gender identity doctrine, trying to disentangle ourselves from this narrative of right versus left wing. So I want to move on to some of the questions, and I think I'd better bring up straight away then the question that came from one of our supporters, which is about an event that you took part in recently. So the question is that you took part in an event hosted by MCC Brussels, which is a think tank connected to Orban's government in Hungary. Also has close links with the Heritage Foundation, the Christian right architects of Project 25, who are advancing their Trumpian agenda in Europe. This event, which launched an MC Brussels authored report on radical gender ideology, was hosted by Andras Laszlo, an MEP and president of Patriots for Europe, the biggest far-right bloc in the European Parliament. So the question is, how does collaborating with much more powerful radical right actors intent on advancing an anti-migrant, anti-gay, anti-feminist and anti-democratic agenda benefit women or LGB people? Well, yes, I'm sure you can untangle that question.
This is a big question. It also mixes up some things. So the part about the MEP and the Patriots hosting this event or participating in the event is not correct. But I don't want to go into details so much. It just in general, my approach to these kinds of questions when they come up for myself, you know, where do I participate, where do I speak or not? In the past, I have had to navigate a very narrow corridor of what is allowed for me to do and what not, because of what others think that they can prescribe onto me. And I found that, you know, very transgressive. When I started my mandate, well, you know, the question is like, are you relevant or not? And as a political person, I was relevant, and as a politician, and I still am relevant. So when I took my mandate first and became a politician in 2015, from 2016 on, I was smeared as being aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. And that happened because I was meeting with a Muslim youth organization. As I met with the young men and women active in that organization, and they were said to be aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. So by association, I became smeared as aligned with them. And what was the association? The association was meeting with them and posting photos of that meeting on social media. So there was publicity around it. And just to think how absurd it is, you know, to place me in vicinity of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think even they would have a laugh about it. And then when I went to speak at the LGB Alliance conference in 2022, where you invited me after I was uninvited from the other conference, I was smeared as being hateful and an extremist because the LGB Alliance was seen as hateful and extremist. There was an open letter against me for going there and speaking there, signed by my colleagues from my own party and by politicians from other parties. It was framed as L with the T, so you know, the lesbians that stand with their trans siblings. But then eventually at one point they opened it up for anybody who wanted to sign, because I think there were so many people who wanted to sign but were not lesbians. So they allowed everybody to sign. And in 2023, when I spoke here in Vienna at the Let Women Speak event that Kelly J. Keane, Posey Parker organized here, I was smeared by my own party as aligned with the far right, because she was seen as far right. And so these accusations, whether true or not, happen. And I think it is a basic thing that should have widespread understanding and support. And when you sit on a panel with other people, that does not mean that you endorse what the other panelists say. On the contrary, I think it is quite good if you do not, because it would be quite boring if everybody would bring in the same perspective into a discussion. So the other panelists are the other panelists, and I bring forward my position, and I'm invited for my position. And then I have to take the decision, do I do this or not? And for me, and everybody has to decide for themselves if they do this or not. But for me, it is a strategic question. What are my aims? What do I want to achieve? And is this strategically wise or the right thing to do at this moment in this context? And this will be different for everybody else, because the context might be different. It might not be the right moment. You might drag your organization into something that you don't want to drag them into. It might have different effects. So I would advise everybody to really make strategic decisions about this kind of things. And this was a decision that I took for a platform that I thought was very necessary to have. It was the first gender critical event that took place in Brussels. And I gladly would have spoken within the European Parliament or any other progressive or liberal forum or space, but we know that they never do this.
Thank you so much. I wanted you to discuss this at length because it comes up again and again, this guilt by association. Oh, don't you know, you're far right because you do this or you do that. And so thank you for clarifying your position so well. I want to move on to a different topic, which is religion. The question was, how does the European Commission, but we could broaden this to people in general who say they are supportive of minority rights, how do they deal with the conflict between the gender identity people and religious minorities, Orthodox Muslims or Orthodox Jews, who, for instance, are not permitted according to their religious rules to be in mixed sex spaces? How do they deal with that?
Yeah, they don't deal with it at all. So especially with anti-discrimination legislation, we see that what they do is they have those categories or protected groups that they would name like one after the other. So you would have gender, which used to mean sex, and then you would have sexual orientation, and then you would have age, disability, religion, or worldview. And they are just adding categories there. So next to sexual orientation, they attach gender identity, and then they might add one thing or another or exchange it. So sex no longer is sex, it is gender. Everybody just interprets into it whatever they want to see, but they add these categories. And I think for many from an institutional religious context, it is satisfactory that religion is still there, that it's not dropped. Often it is still contested in whatever direction you go, whether it's, let's say, Christianity or Islam. There are many discussions around it. It's not easy anyways, but for the institutions that are doing it, so the EU, for example, or the Council of Europe, it's just adding, it's additive. You know,
so they have that position, rights are not a pie, and they refuse to acknowledge that there's conflict between those different groups. They just won't acknowledge it.
They absolutely do not acknowledge it, but that also comes from a total lack of understanding of what it is that they are pushing for. So what does gender identity actually mean? Because there is conflict between sexual orientation and gender identity, and they seem oblivious to that. There is conflict between women's rights and gender identity, and they are oblivious to that. The other question is, what is going on with the religious organizations? Why are they not addressing it? And so the experience that I've had is that was on the activist level, that it is also very difficult for these activist groups to disentangle themselves from networks or allyships that they ended up in. over the years, because this is something that has been done strategically in parts by the LGBTIQ side, but it was also of benefit to the other sides. So when you have activist groups, and some are queer activists, others are activists against racism, others are activists for climate, others are active against anti-Muslim racism, for example, you kind of need other groups, social movements that support you. So they ended up in a lot of networks and an allyship with each other, which meant that this group will stand up for this one and vice versa. They would also repeat the slogans, the convictions, the belief system of each other, as long as it did not touch them or affect them deeply.
And of course, it does affect them. So what you find then, you'll presumably find Orthodox Jews and Muslims self-excluding from spaces rather than making a fuss. Is that what you're saying?
It does affect them, but it also takes time and thinking for them to understand the ways in which it affects them. And I had this experience when I spoke out publicly here in Austria, and I was ostracized by everyone around me. As I've been very much embedded in these activist contexts, they were also very much turning against me. So I was like an insider that was, in their view, betraying them. So all of these activist groups took a position against me, but I was still a politician, a member of parliament for the Greens, and we were in government then. And I was a spokeswoman for integration, and I would organize monthly networking meetings with the NGOs that are working in this area. And I had an organization that I helped get funding for also and supported for years, that is working on anti-Muslim racism. And they wrote me and said that unfortunately they cannot attend my networking event because they do not have a position internally. They did not manage to have a position internally on trans gender identity. And they fear that if they come to the networking meeting and somebody brings this issue up, they would have to position themselves. But because they don't have a position, they would have to remain silent, and their silence would make them suspicious. And that's why they self-censored and stayed away from that meeting. And I felt very sorry for them because, and I wrote back to them, there is a saying that we have here in Austria in German, and it translates as, if you scare yourself to death, you still die. If you're so scared of the consequences of what you do or what you do not do, you're unable to do anything. You're unable to move, to criticize. And so that is the state that they are in, and they cannot criticize the other organizations for those points or demands that they have that would affect them and would have a detrimental effect on them, because they are so obliged to each other.
Yeah. Yes, that's a very sad state of affairs. I want to move on to another question, which is just very briefly the difference between EU and UK in law, the distinction between sex and gender, which is clearly stated anyway. I mean, we have sex, as you know, as a protected characteristic in the Equality Act in the UK, and nothing very similar within the EU or I think other Council of Europe countries. And that has perhaps made it possible to have all these legal cases in the UK, which would be more difficult in the EU. Could you say, do you think we're going to be getting legal cases like this in the EU?
I think I'm sure there will be legal cases. There are already legal cases in some countries. It will have a different basis than in the UK. The challenges that we have is that often in language, we cannot distinguish between sex and gender. And that makes it even more complicated. makes it more complicated to raise awareness with anybody, let's say on the political level. It creeps into legislation much easier, and it is very difficult to then differentiate between what is this law now allowing, what is it actually referring to, where are the lines of conflict. So I think this is a big issue. And then you also have, well, let's say maybe sloppy translations or ideological translations of text, because it's very difficult often to know if text says gender, what it actually is that it refers to.
Yeah, I was very surprised when you told me that, because we know that the European Court of Human Rights uses French and English, that actually when it comes to this, the texts are different. And which is astonishing, really, because they both have equal value, don't they?
Yes, but it is a question of interpretation. So now when the Council of Europe says gender, what do they actually mean? Do they mean gender just as a synonym for sex? Or do they mean gender in a way that describes social norms and roles? So in what way is gender used? So it's very, very difficult. And in the French versions, it still says sex. So the French translations are clear, it is sex. But it's not only a linguistic nuance, it is actually really ideological concepts that are written into this. And then imagine this in the whole of the European Union with all the different languages. And so and people are also getting used to certain terminologies and are not questioning it. And this also goes for the conservatives. I think the conservatives have also become so used to hearing gender this and gender that. I remember back in the 1990s when it became more mainstream to use gender in German language, because we did not translate everything. So gender budgeting, for example, was a thing. So you look at your budget, at the state budget, and you look at how the provision, the allocation of money to different sectors affects women and men differently. And I think it's a good thing to do that, and you get relevant information back that can then inform your policies again. But it was just called gender budgeting.
Well, I remember when I was working at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the translation department in the 1990s. And one day we were told we shouldn't use the word sex anymore. We should say gender because sex has associations to do with sexual intercourse. So we would just say gender. Okay, we all did it from one day to the next, and it never occurred to anyone that this could ever cause problems. I just we're running a little bit short of time, so I want to move on a bit because we have to talk about the future. How do you see the future, and what can we do to move the future? What can we do to raise awareness and bend the arc of history towards justice for women and LGB people?
Very good question.
All right. So what do you think?
I think the first step for me would be, and that's what I was trying to do these past weeks and months when I co-authored a number of articles about what is going on within the EU, the Council of Europe. We have another article coming out about the UN. So for people to become more aware, and when I say people, it's mainly the Anglosphere. So everybody is very impressed with what is going on in the UK. People in continental Europe are closely following all the developments, all the court cases, the diversification of organizations, but also of individuals that you have speaking from different positions is very impressive, also very motivating. But I feel that Europe, meaning EU and COE predominantly, have been ignored for too long. And also the effects that this has, not only on the member states, not only on the accession and candidate countries of the EU, which are of course also then forced to already implement certain legislation, or they will in anticipatory obedience do so, but the whole region of Europe and beyond, through funding policies, through foreign policies. So to understand the effect that this has and to really move attention in that direction. So the first thing is to understand the relevance. And I think the second thing is to know about what has been going on for the past years now and still goes on behind closed doors, and to bring it to daylight. Most of these things, they don't go very well with daylight. If you look at them closely, one of the most outrageous things I find is the LGBTIQ equality strategy, which calls for self-ID without age limits. And I think this is something that has to be...
We go back to this IGLIO, the so-called Denton's report, which has told activists how to get this implemented. And we know in Norway, you can change your so-called gender at the age of 6, and now in Germany, then from birth, it seems. But as a translator, of course, I'm immediately thinking how translations ought to work. It strikes me that your amazing command of English must be one of the reasons why you have been able to follow so closely what's going on in the UK and been able to translate that to what needs to happen in the Council of Europe and the EU. So do you think we need a translation unit which, for instance, informs people throughout the Council of Europe about these court cases? Do we need, would that be a helpful thing?
To be honest, no. I don't think it's so much of a language issue. As I said, people that I'm in touch with and work with closely in Germany, in Hungary, in France, in Spain, here in Austria, are following very closely what is happening, and they understand very well what is happening. But the problem that we are faced with, so the first thing is to understand the relevance of the EU context, to know what has been going on, and that is not a question of language, but many of these things are hidden. I mean, who knows that there is this LGBTIQ strategy? Who knows that Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, said in 2020 that they will make hate speech and hate crime a so-called EU crime. At the moment, there are 10 so-called EU crimes, which are major transnational crimes, such as human trafficking, cybercriminality, drugs, weapon smuggling. And they want to make hate speech and hate crime one of those crimes. And then you have to have a foundation for hate speech. And the foundation comes from, well, sexism, racism, and something that is against LGBTIQ rights. And how do you fill that? Well, you fill it with the LGBTIQ equality strategy. So whatever they define and they say that is hateful, then feeds into this.
But you said we need to know about these things that are going on. So what are you suggesting that people do? So what are your positive suggestions?
Well, so this is what we have been trying for the past weeks, is to break it down in digestible chunks and bring it out in the open, so that it becomes a common knowledge that we can build on. And what I think is important is to organize nationally. Every national context is different and has different requirements. You cannot have one model that will work in Hungary and will work in Germany and will work in Spain. So to organize within the national context, and that will mean to have collaborations with others that might not seem your natural friends, maybe, or collaborators. So it could be parents. I think parents is a group that's very important to reach out to. Parents, detransitioners, lesbians and gays, feminists, but also conservatives. They could be conservatives, they could be Christians. There might be unlikely coalitions, but to organize on a national level, to form those coalitions that are impactful and strategic, and to pressure your national and also your European politicians and political parties. The challenge is to overcome the threshold that you become noticeable and relevant to media,
And
and to the political sphere.
Does that require direct action? You mean? Somebody asked about street turfing. Is that necessary in order to get into the media?
I think street turfing worked very well in the UK and has its place there. It might not be something that is workable yet in other countries. You need to have the organization around it, the momentum around it. I think it has big value in that it helps with internal cohesion, and that it can be very motivational. But it is something that is not very developed yet throughout the rest of Europe, and I would assess whether this is impactful with the resources that you have. You have to to look at who are you working with, what is it that you can do effectively, and how can you be effective with the resources that you have.
And so somebody asks about the Green Party. Do you see any hope of retrieving the Green parties across the EU and the UK from capture by gender identity doctrine? I mean, as a member of, and you still, I presume you have something of a fraught relationship now with the Green Party. We won't go into that, but what do you think of the Green parties across the UK and the EU?
Well, I must say, no, I don't think so. I mean, I do see signs of hope, especially for those who have come into this later, so who were not very early adopters, as in the English-speaking region. They were very early. They are so deep in it, and they've taken so many decisions that it is very difficult to reverse that or to stop it even. For the other ones that are not so deep into it, I see some signs. So now we recently had International Women's Day, and I've seen the asterisk next to women go in some communication. I also think that some do understand that talking about pregnant persons, menstruators, and so on does not look good. And it is all over social media once you do it. So you cannot really hide it. It's difficult to hide it. If you do it, people will pick it up and it will be communicated. And there are two things I think that work with political parties. One is to expose what they are doing, so to really find these things, expose it, bring it out into the light. And the other thing is pressure or consequences at the ballot.
Yeah, well, that's clear. And so, talking about the ballot, somebody wants to ask you: do you plan to get back into politics?
Absolutely not.
I think not into party politics, you mean, don't you?
Exactly. Yeah. So I've always considered myself a political person. Always been doing political work. I feel very, very lucky and blessed that I could always do what I was passionate about as work, and I cannot imagine myself not doing political work also now in future. But I've become very frustrated with party politics and with politicians. More than frustrated. Actually, I hold quite an amount of contempt for them. It's the cowardice, it's the ignorance, it's the incompetence that they show, and I doubt the workings of party politics. It is very rare to find a politician that does not toe the party line, and I'm very, very happy to be out of hours and hours and hours of committee meetings and sessions that are purely performative.
Yeah,
and
well,
they
that's
are purely
very,
performative.
yeah, thank you.
One would assume that when you have a debate, you can actually debate something and you have different positions meet and exchange, but it's none of that. It is purely performative.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
yeah, I'm
We're going to have
identifying
to,
out of being a politician.
we're going to have to wind up. I just want to say to those whose questions we didn't get to, we did as much as possible. And thank you for answering, for sending in your questions. And thank you, Faika, so much. And you spoke about the way that fear holds people back. Well, it certainly doesn't hold you back. And I think that your courage and integrity and the amazing way you can articulate, express yourself is an absolute inspiration to us all. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bev. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.